Berlin, 1943. While American soldiers fought their way through North Africa and the Pacific, an entirely different kind of war was being waged in the heart of Nazi Germany. A war so quiet, so invisible, that even today most people have never heard of it. In the exclusive butcher shop on Friedrichstrasse, where only the highest-ranking SS officers could purchase their meat, a middle-aged man named Heinrich Wolff stood behind his counter, wrapping cuts of beef with hands that had been preparing meat for 30 years. But on this particular autumn morning, those same hands were about to commit an act so dangerous, so calculated, that discovery would mean not just his death, but the torture and execution of everyone he loved. What the uniformed men collecting their orders didn't know was that the prime cuts they were selecting for a grand banquet celebrating Heinrich Himmler's visit contained something extra, something microscopic, something that would turn their celebration into a nightmare they would never forget. The promise is simple, but chilling. By the end of this story, you'll discover how an ordinary butcher, armed with nothing but his skill and access to the tables of evil, turned his shop into a biological weapon against the Third Reich's elite. You'll learn why this act of resistance has been buried in the footnotes of history, whispered about in underground resistance circles, but never fully documented. And you'll understand the terrible price of fighting monsters when you can't carry a gun or join the partisans hiding in the forests. This is not a story about soldiers or spies. This is about a man who weaponized the one thing he controlled, the food that sustained his enemies. To understand Heinrich's transformation from skilled tradesman to silent saboteur, you need to know what Berlin looked like in 1943. The city that had once been the vibrant capital of culture and commerce had become the administrative heart of a genocidal empire. SS headquarters loomed over neighborhoods where Jewish families had been dragged from their homes just months before. The streets were filled with uniforms, propaganda, and the constant fear that defined life under totalitarian rule. For most Germans, there were only three choices: enthusiastic collaboration, quiet compliance, or resistance that almost always ended in death. Heinrich Wolff had chosen compliance for years, telling himself that surviving was enough, that keeping his shop open and his family fed was the most he could hope for in such times. But Heinrich's world had been built on relationships, and those relationships were disappearing one by one. His Jewish suppliers had vanished first, their shops boarded up, their families gone to destinations no one spoke about openly. Then came his nephew, a university student who made the mistake of telling a joke about Hitler to the wrong person. Heinrich had to identify the body after the Gestapo finished with him. His best friend from childhood, a social democrat who refused to give the Nazi salute, was sent to Sachsenhausen and never returned. Each loss carved away at Heinrich's compliance, replacing it with something colder and more determined. By the spring of 1943, when the SS began using his shop exclusively for their officer banquets, Heinrich Wolff was no longer the man who simply wanted to survive. He had become a man looking for an opportunity to strike back. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. There were no recruitment meetings or underground cells. Heinrich's resistance began in the most mundane way possible. He started paying attention. He noticed which officers ordered what cuts. He learned their schedules, their preferences, their habits. He discovered that the SS was planning an elaborate banquet for mid-November, a celebration of the Reich's strength with Himmler himself expected to attend. The order was massive: 50 kilograms of the finest beef, premium veal, choice pork. It would be prepared in Heinrich's shop, aged to perfection, and delivered 3 days before the event. And as Heinrich wrote down the specifications in his order book, an idea began to form. An idea so dangerous that even thinking it felt like treason. What Heinrich needed was help from someone with medical knowledge, someone who understood biology and parasites, someone willing to risk everything. That person existed, working quietly in a small clinic on the eastern edge of the city. Dr. Ernst Becker had been treating resistance fighters in secret for 2 years, setting broken bones from Gestapo beatings and providing false medical certificates to keep young men out of the Wehrmacht. When Heinrich approached him one cold October evening, the doctor listened to the plan with the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted that death might come at any moment. Within a week, Dr. Becker had cultivated parasitic worms in his laboratory, microscopic larvae that would survive in raw meat and become active in the human digestive system. The weapon was ready. All Heinrich had to do was use it without getting caught. The incident that would change everything began not with Heinrich's decision, but with a routine inspection that made his plan both possible and necessary. On October 28, 1943, 2 Gestapo officers appeared at his shop without warning, conducting what they called a loyalty verification. They examined his books, questioned his employees, and made it clear that any supplier to the SS was being watched for the slightest deviation from absolute obedience. One of the officers, a young man with cold eyes and a Berlin accent, stood uncomfortably close to Heinrich and told him that his shop had been selected as the exclusive provider for Himmler's Banquet because of his reputation for perfection. Any failure, any contamination, any problem whatsoever would be considered sabotage. The penalty for sabotage was immediate execution, followed by the arrest of all family members. As the officer spoke, Heinrich felt his wife Anna watching from the doorway of their apartment above the shop, her face pale with fear. This wasn't just a warning, it was a test. That night, Heinrich sat at his kitchen table unable to sleep, weighing the impossible mathematics of resistance. If he did nothing, the banquet would proceed, Himmler would celebrate, and the machinery of genocide would continue without interruption. His shop would keep serving the men who had murdered his nephew, imprisoned his friends, and turned his beloved city into a monument to cruelty. He would survive, yes, but survival under those terms had begun to feel like a different kind of death. But if he acted, if he followed through with the plan he and Dr. Becker had discussed, the risks were almost incomprehensible. Discovery meant torture, not just for him, but for Anna, for their daughter Maria studying in Munich, for anyone the Gestapo could connect to his life. And yet, as Heinrich sat there in the darkness, he realized that the Gestapo's warning had actually given him the perfect cover. They expected perfection, which meant they wouldn't suspect sabotage from someone they had just threatened into compliance. The SS order arrived in writing 3 days later, delivered by an adjutant who made Heinrich sign multiple documents acknowledging his responsibility for quality and freshness. 50 kilograms of beef tenderloin, aged for exactly 14 days. 20 kilograms of veal, milk-fed and premium grade. 15 kilograms of pork loin, heritage breed preferred. The meat was to be delivered on November 10th to the SS banquet hall on Prince Albrechtstrasse, where it would be prepared by their own chefs under strict supervision. Heinrich read the order twice, noting the delivery date. That gave him 12 days to age the meat properly, which meant he needed to begin the contamination process no later than November 5th. The timeline was tight, but workable. What worried him more was the inspection process. SS protocols required that all meat be examined by their own veterinary officer before acceptance. If the parasites were visible, if anything appeared wrong, Heinrich would be arrested on the spot. Dr. Becker solved that problem with the precision of a scientist who understood both biology and desperation. The parasitic larvae he had cultivated were a specific strain of trichinella, microscopic worms that would be completely invisible to the naked eye and would survive the aging process inside the muscle tissue. They would only become active after consumption, taking approximately 48 to 72 hours to cause symptoms. By the time the first officer felt the cramping and nausea, the banquet would be long over, and tracing the source would be nearly impossible. The doctor explained all of this in his clinic, speaking quietly while injecting the larvae into small vials of saline solution. Each vial contained enough parasites to contaminate 5 kilograms of meat. Heinrich would need 10 vials total. As Becker handed over the contaminated solution, carefully packed in a wooden medical case, he looked Heinrich directly in the eyes and asked the question that had been hanging between them since their first conversation. Was Heinrich absolutely certain he wanted to do this, knowing there was no way back once the meat was injected? Heinrich took the case without hesitation, but his hands were shaking as he walked back through the darkened streets of Berlin. The weight of what he carried felt enormous, not because of the physical mass, but because of what it represented. Inside that case was the power to strike back against men who seemed untouchable, to inflict suffering on those who had inflicted so much suffering on others. But it was also a death sentence waiting to be discovered, a bundle of glass vials that could shatter his entire world if anyone stopped him, if anyone searched his bag, if anyone asked the wrong question. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, he could hear Anna moving around in the kitchen, preparing their meager dinner from the rations she had saved. He couldn't tell her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. This burden was his alone to carry. November 5th arrived with the kind of grey, cold morning that made Berlin feel like a city wrapped in steel and fog. Heinrich opened his shop at exactly 6 in the morning, as he had done for 3 decades, but this time his routine carried a weight that made every movement feel deliberate and dangerous. The beef had been delivered 2 days earlier, premium cuts from Bavaria that represented the finest meat available in wartime Germany. It hung now in his refrigeration room, properly aged and ready for the final stage of preparation. Heinrich's 2 employees, both older men conscripted into butchering because they were too old for military service, arrived at 7 and began their normal work in the front of the shop. Heinrich told them he would handle the SS order personally, that such an important contract required his direct supervision. They nodded without question, accustomed to Heinrich's perfectionism and grateful not to bear responsibility for such a high-stakes job. What they didn't see was Heinrich locking the refrigeration room door from the inside, or the small medical case he had hidden beneath his apron. The injection process was painstakingly slow and methodically precise. Heinrich had spent the previous evening practicing with saline and cheap cuts, learning the exact angle and depth needed to distribute the parasitic solution throughout the muscle tissue without leaving visible puncture marks. Each piece of beef required multiple injections, carefully spaced to ensure even contamination. He started with the tenderloin, the most expensive and prestigious cut, the meat that would certainly be served to Himmler and the highest-ranking officers. The needle slid into the deep red flesh with barely any resistance, and Heinrich pressed the plunger slowly, watching the liquid disappear into the muscle fibers. 1 injection, 2, 3, moving systematically across the surface, creating an invisible grid of contamination. His hands remained steady despite the voice in his head, screaming about what would happen if someone knocked on the door, if someone demanded to know why he had locked himself inside, if the Gestapo decided to conduct another surprise inspection. By mid-afternoon, Heinrich had processed 30 kilograms of beef and moved on to the veal. The younger meat was softer, more delicate, and required even more careful handling to avoid obvious damage. Sweat dripped down his face despite the refrigerated air, not from physical exertion, but from the crushing psychological pressure of what he was doing. Each injection was an act of war, a silent declaration that he would not go quietly into the darkness of collaboration, but it was also an act that could never be undone, never be taken back. Once this meat left his shop, once it was delivered to the SS banquet hall, the consequences would unfold whether Heinrich was ready for them or not. He thought about his nephew, beaten to death for a joke. He thought about the empty shops where Jewish families had sold vegetables and bread. He thought about the trains leaving Berlin, packed with people who would never return. And he kept injecting. The pork was the final stage, and by the time Heinrich finished, darkness had fallen outside and his employees had long since gone home. He stood in the refrigeration room surrounded by contaminated meat, feeling a strange mixture of terror and satisfaction. The work was done. The weapon was prepared. All that remained was the waiting, the careful performance of normalcy, while the days ticked down toward November 10th. Heinrich cleaned his instruments with obsessive thoroughness, disposing of the empty vials by crushing them into powder and flushing the remains down the drain. He scrubbed every surface, eliminated every trace of what had happened in that room. Then he unlocked the door, hung the meat on proper hooks for continued aging, and went upstairs to where Anna was waiting with dinner. She looked at his face and asked if everything was all right. Heinrich smiled and told her the SS order was progressing perfectly, that everything was under control. The next 5 days were an exercise in sustained psychological torture. Heinrich went through the motions of normal life, serving regular customers, preparing standard orders, joking with his employees about the weather and the latest propaganda broadcasts. But underneath the performance, his mind was consumed with scenarios of discovery. He imagined the veterinary inspector finding something wrong with the meat, imagined Gestapo officers storming into his shop with questions he couldn't answer. He imagined Anna being dragged from their apartment, his daughter Maria being pulled from her university classes. Every time the shop door opened, his heart rate spiked. Every unfamiliar face seemed like a potential threat. At night, he lay awake listening to Anna's breathing, wondering if he had made a catastrophic mistake, wondering if his desire for revenge would destroy the few people he still had left to love. November 10th arrived with crystalline clarity, the kind of bitter cold that turned breath into visible clouds and made the streets of Berlin crunch underfoot with frost. The SS transport truck appeared outside Heinrich's shop at precisely 8 in the morning, driven by 2 uniformed soldiers who showed no emotion as they presented their collection paperwork. Behind them stood the veterinary inspector, a middle-aged man in civilian clothes carrying a leather medical bag and an expression of bureaucratic boredom. This was the moment Heinrich had been dreading most, the moment when his work would either pass undetected or condemn him to immediate execution. He led them to the refrigeration room, with hands that he forced to remain steady, unlocking the door and gesturing toward the hanging meat with what he hoped looked like professional pride. The inspector approached the beef first, running his fingers along the surface, checking color and texture, examining the marbling with the practiced eye of someone who had done this assessment hundreds of times before. The inspection lasted 23 minutes, though to Heinrich it felt like hours compressed into an eternity of frozen time. The veterinary officer took samples, small cores of tissue that he examined under a portable microscope, right there in the refrigeration room. Heinrich's heart hammered so hard he was certain everyone could hear it, but he maintained his facade of calm professionalism, answering questions about aging time and storage temperature with the authority of 3 decades of experience. The parasitic larvae were microscopic, Dr. Becker had assured him, completely invisible without sophisticated laboratory analysis that wouldn't happen until after the banquet. But assurances meant nothing in this moment, standing 3 feet away from a man who could destroy everything with a single observation. The inspector made notes on his clipboard, checked measurements against the original order, and finally turned to Heinrich with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. The meat was acceptable, he declared. Premium quality, properly aged, exactly as specified. The soldiers could proceed with loading. The relief that flooded through Heinrich's body was so intense, it was almost painful. But he couldn't show it, couldn't let even a flicker of emotion cross his face. He helped the soldiers carry the meat to the truck, wrapping each piece in clean white paper with the same care he always demonstrated, playing his role perfectly. The veterinary inspector signed the transfer documents and handed Heinrich his copy, official proof that the meat had passed all inspections and was now the responsibility of the SS banquet organizers. As the truck pulled away from his shop, exhaust smoke hanging in the frozen air, Heinrich stood on the sidewalk and watched it disappear around the corner toward Prince Albrechtstrasse. 50 kilograms of contaminated beef, 20 kilograms of infected veal, 15 kilograms of poisoned pork, all of it now beyond his control, moving inexorably toward the tables where Germany's most powerful and evil men would consume it without suspicion. The banquet was scheduled for November 13th, 3 days away, giving the SS chefs time to prepare the elaborate menu that had been planned for months. Heinrich knew the general outline from the adjutant who had delivered the order: a 6-course feast celebrating the Reich's resilience and Himmler's leadership, with the finest beef as the centerpiece of the main course. Approximately 60 high-ranking officers would attend, including division commanders, Gestapo directors, and administrative officials who managed the logistics of genocide from comfortable Berlin offices. These were not frontline soldiers following orders under duress. These were the architects and enthusiasts of the Nazi machinery, men who had chosen their positions and relished their power. The thought of them seated together, consuming contaminated meat while toasting their Führer, gave Heinrich a dark satisfaction that he had never experienced before. He wasn't a violent man by nature, had never hurt anyone in his entire life. But he had learned that violence came in many forms, and sometimes the quietest acts inflicted the deepest wounds. For 3 days, Heinrich existed in a strange state of suspended reality, going through the familiar routines of his shop, while his mind remained fixed on that banquet hall across the city. He served his regular customers with mechanical politeness, prepared their orders with his usual skill, and closed the shop each evening at the normal time. But nothing felt normal. He was waiting for something he couldn't predict, an outcome he couldn't control, a consequence that would either validate his actions or expose them as a futile gesture that accomplished nothing except his own destruction. Anna sensed his distraction and pressed him gently about what was wrong, but Heinrich deflected with complaints about supply shortages and difficult customers. He couldn't burden her with the truth. If the Gestapo came, her genuine ignorance might save her life. November 13th was a Saturday, and Heinrich kept his shop open despite having almost no inventory to sell. He needed the distraction of work, the familiar rhythm of customers and small talk, anything to keep his mind from spiraling into panic about what was happening across the city at that very moment. The banquet was scheduled to begin at 7 in the evening, which meant the contaminated meat was probably already being prepared in the SS kitchens, being seasoned and roasted and plated with all the ceremony befitting such an important occasion. Heinrich tried to imagine the scene: white tablecloths and silver cutlery, uniformed officers laughing and drinking expensive wine stolen from France, Himmler himself presiding over the celebration of an empire built on mass murder. And somewhere in that scene, on those pristine plates, sat Heinrich's quiet revenge. The parasitic larvae would survive the cooking process if the meat was prepared rare or medium rare, which was exactly how the SS preferred their beef. Dr. Becker had explained the biology with clinical precision. The worms would activate in the digestive system, beginning their reproduction cycle approximately 48 hours after consumption. The waiting was its own form of torture, made worse by the fact that Heinrich couldn't share it with anyone. He moved through Sunday and Monday in a fog of anxiety, jumping at every sound, interpreting every customer's casual comment as a potential threat. But the city remained normal, the streets filled with their usual mix of uniforms and civilians, no unusual Gestapo activity, no signs of emergency at SS headquarters. Heinrich began to wonder if the plan had failed entirely, if somehow the parasites had died during cooking, or if Dr. Becker's calculations had been wrong. Maybe the meat had been examined more carefully before serving. Maybe someone had noticed something wrong and the entire meal had been discarded. The uncertainty was almost worse than discovery would have been, because at least discovery would have provided clarity, an ending to the unbearable suspense of not knowing whether his actions had accomplished anything at all. Tuesday morning brought the first indication that something had gone catastrophically right. One of Heinrich's regular customers, an elderly woman who cleaned offices in the government district, came into the shop with gossip that she could barely contain. "There was chaos at SS headquarters," she whispered, her eyes wide with the thrill of forbidden information. Multiple high-ranking officers had fallen violently ill, struck down by some kind of food poisoning that had them doubled over with stomach cramps and worse. The entire administrative building was in disarray, with doctors rushing between offices and rumors flying about contaminated food at Saturday's banquet. The woman didn't know details, only that her supervisor had told the cleaning staff to stay away from certain floors because of the medical emergency. She shared this news with the conspiratorial delight of someone passing along scandalous gossip, having no idea she was speaking to the man responsible for the entire crisis. Heinrich listened with carefully constructed shock and concern, making appropriate noises of surprise while his heart hammered with a mixture of triumph and terror. It had worked. The parasites had survived, had activated, had begun doing exactly what Dr. Becker promised they would do. Somewhere across Berlin, SS officers who had sat at that banquet were experiencing the agony of contaminated meat working through their systems, their bodies becoming battlegrounds for microscopic invaders they never saw coming. But Heinrich's satisfaction was immediately complicated by a new fear: investigation. Food poisoning at a high-profile SS banquet wouldn't be dismissed as simple bad luck. There would be inquiries, inspections, interrogations. Someone would trace the meat back to its source, back to Heinrich's shop, back to the butcher who had prepared it. The Gestapo would come, and when they did, Heinrich would have no defense, no explanation that could save him. He spent Tuesday afternoon preparing for the inevitable, going through his shop with meticulous attention to ensure nothing suspicious remained. The medical case from Dr. Becker had been destroyed days ago, the vials crushed and disposed of, but Heinrich checked anyway, his paranoia driving him to search every corner for evidence that didn't exist. He thought about running, taking Anna and disappearing into the chaos of wartime Germany, but he knew that was impossible. Desertion would only confirm guilt and endanger Maria. His only option was to maintain the performance of innocence, to act shocked when questioned, to insist that his meat had been perfect and properly inspected. He had to become the outraged craftsman, whose reputation was being unfairly questioned, the loyal supplier who had done everything correctly. It was a thin protection, but it was all he had. Wednesday morning shattered any remaining hope Heinrich had of avoiding scrutiny. 2 Gestapo officers arrived at his shop before he had even finished opening, their black Mercedes parked prominently on the street where every neighbor could see it. They weren't the same officers who had conducted the loyalty inspection in October, and their demeanor was considerably less polite. The taller one, a man with a scarred jaw and eyes that radiated casual cruelty, informed Heinrich that he was being summoned for questioning regarding the SS Banquet contamination incident. It wasn't an arrest, not yet, but the distinction felt meaningless as they escorted him to their vehicle, with hands that gripped his arms just tight enough to hurt. Heinrich caught a glimpse of Anna's face in the apartment window above the shop, pale and terrified, and he tried to communicate reassurance through his expression, even though he felt nothing but dread. The drive to Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse took less than 10 minutes, but every second felt like a countdown to his execution. The interrogation room was exactly what Heinrich had imagined during his sleepless nights. Bare concrete walls, a single overhead light, a wooden table with 2 chairs positioned to create maximum psychological intimidation. They left him alone for nearly an hour, a standard technique designed to let fear do the preliminary work of breaking down resistance. Heinrich sat perfectly still, forcing himself to breathe normally, rehearsing his story over and over in his mind. He was a loyal butcher who had provided premium meat according to exact specifications. The meat had been inspected and approved by their own veterinary officer. If there was contamination, it must have occurred during preparation or storage at the banquet hall itself. He had done nothing wrong. He had documentation proving his compliance. He was the victim here, a craftsman whose reputation was being destroyed by circumstances beyond his control. The story was solid, but Heinrich knew that truth and survival weren't always connected in rooms like this. When the interrogator finally entered, he was younger than Heinrich expected, maybe 35 years old, with the kind of educated accent that suggested university training before the war. He introduced himself as Sturmbannführer Werner Koch and explained the situation with clinical detachment. 63 SS officers had fallen ill after the November 13th banquet, 17 of them severely enough to require hospitalization. Preliminary medical analysis suggested parasitic contamination, specifically Trichinella larvae, consistent with infected pork or beef. 2 officers had died, including a decorated division commander who had served on the Eastern Front. This wasn't simple food poisoning, this was potential sabotage, possibly biological terrorism, and the investigation would be thorough and uncompromising. Koch laid out photographs on the table. Heinrich's shop, the delivery truck, the inspection documentation, even images of the contaminated meat itself taken before cooking. Then he asked the first question with the kind of quiet intensity that was somehow more frightening than shouting. Had Heinrich Wolff deliberately contaminated the meat supplied for the SS banquet? Heinrich's denial was immediate and emphatic, his outrage perfectly calibrated to seem genuine, because part of it actually was genuine anger at being accused. He spoke rapidly, explaining his 3 decades of professional reputation, his careful adherence to all regulations, the inspection that had approved every kilogram of meat before delivery. He pointed out that he had served SS officers for years without a single complaint, that destroying his own business through sabotage made no logical sense. Why would he risk everything to poison meat that had been examined by their own veterinary expert? If there was contamination, it had to have occurred after the meat left his possession, during storage or preparation at the banquet hall where he had no control over conditions. Koch listened without expression, taking notes on a pad of paper, occasionally asking follow-up questions that seemed designed to catch inconsistencies. Where did Heinrich source his meat? Who were his suppliers? Did he have any employees with questionable political backgrounds? Had he noticed anything unusual about the beef or pork before delivery? The interrogation continued for 3 hours, covering the same ground repeatedly from different angles, probing for weaknesses in Heinrich's story. Koch was methodical and patient, the kind of investigator who understood that guilty people eventually revealed themselves through small contradictions and nervous tells. But Heinrich had the advantage of having lived with his fear for weeks, having rehearsed this exact scenario in his mind hundreds of times. He maintained his story with unwavering consistency, his indignation never wavering, his documentation supporting every claim. Finally, Koch closed his notebook and stood up, informing Heinrich that he was free to go for now, but should remain available for further questioning. The investigation would continue, he said, and if evidence of deliberate sabotage emerged, the consequences would be severe not just for Heinrich, but for everyone connected to him. It was a threat wrapped in bureaucratic language, a reminder that the Gestapo's reach extended far beyond a single butcher shop. The investigation intensified over the following week, with a thoroughness that confirmed Heinrich's worst fears about how seriously the SS was taking this incident. Gestapo officers descended on his shop like an occupying force, confiscating his records, interrogating his employees separately, examining every piece of equipment in his refrigeration room with forensic precision. They brought in veterinary experts who took samples from his remaining inventory, scientists who swabbed his cutting boards and knives, looking for trace evidence of parasitic contamination. Heinrich's 2 employees were questioned for hours about his behavior before the delivery, about whether he had seemed nervous or acted strangely, about who had access to the meat during the aging process. Both men, terrified for their own lives, told the truth as they knew it. Heinrich had been his usual perfectionist self, perhaps even more careful than normal given the importance of the SS order. They had seen nothing suspicious because there had been nothing for them to see. But the most dangerous development came on November 22nd, when Sturmbannführer Koch returned to the shop with a new piece of information that made Heinrich's blood run cold. The Gestapo had arrested Dr. Ernst Becker 3 days earlier on unrelated charges of providing false medical certificates to draft evaders. During his interrogation, Becker had broken under torture and confessed to resistance activities, including the cultivation of parasitic organisms for undefined purposes. He hadn't mentioned Heinrich by name, not yet, but the connection was obvious and terrifying. Koch watched Heinrich's face carefully as he delivered this information, looking for any flicker of recognition, any sign that the butcher knew the arrested doctor. Heinrich forced his expression to remain blank, confused, appropriately concerned that a medical professional in Berlin was involved in resistance activity, but showing no personal connection to the information. Inside, his mind was screaming. If Becker broke completely, if he gave up Heinrich's name under continued torture, the entire fabrication of innocence would collapse instantly. The next 72 hours were the longest of Heinrich's life, a period of suspended agony where he waited for the inevitable knock on his door that would signal his arrest and execution. He went through the motions of normalcy, even as Gestapo surveillance became increasingly obvious. There was always someone watching his shop now, always a black car parked on the street with occupants who made no effort to hide their presence. Anna knew something terrible was happening, and Heinrich finally told her a carefully edited version of the truth, that he was being investigated for the SS Banquet contamination, that he was innocent, but that the Gestapo didn't always care about innocence when they needed someone to blame. He prepared her for the possibility of his arrest, gave her instructions about where their savings were hidden, made her promise to protect Maria no matter what happened to him. Anna listened with tears streaming down her face, and for the first time, Heinrich saw in her eyes not just fear, but a terrible understanding of what he might have done. On November 25th, the crisis reached its climax in a way Heinrich had not anticipated. Sturmbannführer Koch appeared at the shop alone, without his usual contingent of armed officers, and asked Heinrich to close early for a private conversation. This was it, Heinrich thought. This was the moment when Koch would reveal that Becker had confessed everything, when the performance would end and the consequences would begin. But instead, Koch sat down at Heinrich's cutting table and spoke with an unexpected candor that was somehow more unsettling than threats would have been. The investigation had reached a dead end, he explained. The veterinary analysis had found no trace of parasites in Heinrich's equipment or remaining inventory. The meat had been properly sourced from approved suppliers. The inspection before delivery had been conducted according to protocols and had found nothing wrong. Most significantly, the cooking staff at the banquet hall had admitted to certain irregularities in food storage that could have allowed contamination from external sources. Koch's next words were delivered with the cold pragmatism of a bureaucrat protecting institutional reputation rather than pursuing justice. The SS had decided to officially attribute the contamination to improper storage and preparation at the banquet hall itself, a failure of their own protocols rather than external sabotage. Pursuing the investigation further would only highlight their own incompetence and create embarrassing questions about security failures. Heinrich Wolff would be cleared of all suspicion, his business would be allowed to continue, and the matter would be considered closed. But Koch's eyes, as he delivered this news, held a different message entirely, a look of absolute certainty that said he knew exactly what Heinrich had done, even if he couldn't prove it. The unspoken understanding hung between them like smoke. Heinrich would live, but he would live knowing that Koch knew, and that knowledge would be its own form of imprisonment. The official closure of the investigation should have brought relief, but instead it delivered a different kind of torment that Heinrich hadn't anticipated. He was free, yes, but his freedom came wrapped in the suffocating knowledge that Koch understood the truth and had chosen institutional convenience over justice. The Sturmbannführer's final words before leaving the shop that day had been carefully chosen and deliberately chilling. Sometimes the Reich benefits more from maintaining order than from pursuing every crime to its conclusion, but rest assured that certain individuals remain under observation indefinitely. It was permission to live combined with a promise of perpetual surveillance, an arrangement that served the SS's purposes while ensuring Heinrich would spend the rest of his days looking over his shoulder. The psychological cage was perhaps more effective than any physical prison could have been, because it gave Heinrich just enough freedom to appreciate what he stood to lose if he ever stepped out of line again. The human cost of what Heinrich had accomplished began to crystallize in the weeks following the investigation's closure. The official SS casualty report, leaked through underground resistance channels that Heinrich could no longer safely contact, documented the full scope of his biological attack. 63 officers had been infected with varying degrees of severity. 2 had died during the initial acute phase, their systems overwhelmed by the parasitic invasion. 15 more had suffered permanent digestive damage that would plague them for the rest of their lives. Even those who recovered fully had experienced weeks of excruciating pain, fever, muscle aches, and the kind of intestinal agony that left grown men crying for relief. Heinrich tried to feel satisfaction in these numbers, tried to tell himself that these were monsters who deserved suffering, architects of genocide who had earned every moment of pain. But late at night, alone with his thoughts, he couldn't completely suppress the small voice that questioned whether he had become something he didn't recognize, whether fighting evil with hidden violence had transformed him into a different kind of monster. Dr. Ernst Becker's fate became known in early December through whispered conversations in the black market where Anna bought their food. The doctor had died under Gestapo interrogation on November 28th, his body dumped in a mass grave outside the city without ceremony or acknowledgement. He had never given up Heinrich's name, had endured torture and death while protecting the butcher, who had used his scientific expertise to strike back at the Reich. This knowledge hit Heinrich with devastating force, a guilt that was somehow more crushing than the fear of discovery had been. Becker had been a true hero of the resistance, a man who had risked everything to fight tyranny through the only means available to him. He had provided the weapon Heinrich needed, and had paid the ultimate price while Heinrich walked free. The moral mathematics of this exchange felt impossible to balance. One good man dead to protect one survivor, whose contribution to resistance would end the moment Koch's warning took effect. The banquet itself had achieved its intended purpose in ways that extended beyond the immediate casualties. Word of the contamination spread through SS ranks despite official efforts to suppress the story, creating paranoia about food security that disrupted the comfortable routines of occupation. Officers began demanding that their meals be prepared by trusted personnel, insisted on watching food preparation, developed elaborate rituals of inspection before eating. The psychological impact rippled outward, a small crack in the facade of invincibility that defined Nazi power. Heinrich learned these details through careful observation and occasional comments from customers who had connections to the military bureaucracy. The SS banquet hall on Prince Albrechtstrasse had been permanently closed, its staff reassigned, its reputation destroyed. Future events would be held at different locations with entirely new security protocols. In some small way, Heinrich had forced the machinery of evil to adapt to the possibility of internal threat, had reminded them that even in the heart of Berlin, even among their most trusted suppliers, danger could be hiding in plain sight. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the one Heinrich could never measure or confirm: the possibility that Himmler himself had been among the infected. The official reports were carefully vague about which specific officers had fallen ill, protecting the dignity and reputation of high-ranking personnel. But Heinrich knew that Himmler had attended the banquet, knew that the finest beef would have been reserved for the guest of honor, knew that contamination had been most concentrated in the premium cuts. The thought that the architect of the Holocaust might have spent weeks in agony, might have suffered the invasion of his body by microscopic enemies he never saw coming, provided Heinrich with a dark satisfaction that nothing else could match. It was a small victory in the context of industrial genocide, a pinprick against a machine of murder. But it was his victory, achieved through cunning and courage and a willingness to risk everything for a moment of resistance. The immediate aftermath of Heinrich's survival brought changes that rippled through every aspect of his existence in ways both visible and invisible. The Gestapo surveillance that Koch had promised became a constant presence, rotating personnel but never disappearing entirely. There was always someone watching, always a reminder that Heinrich's freedom was conditional and could be revoked at any moment. His shop's clientele shifted dramatically as SS officers stopped patronizing the establishment that had been associated, however unofficially, with the contamination incident. The business that had once provided comfortable income now barely sustained his family, forcing Anna to take in sewing work and Heinrich to accept customers he would have previously avoided. But the loss of Nazi patronage also brought an unexpected consequence. Members of the resistance, people who somehow knew or suspected what Heinrich had done, began appearing at his shop with quiet requests and meaningful glances. They never spoke openly about the banquet, never confirmed their knowledge, but their presence communicated recognition and respect that Heinrich found both gratifying and terrifying. Heinrich's relationship with Anna transformed in the months following the investigation, the unspoken truth hanging between them like a wall neither could fully breach. She had pieced together enough from his warnings and the Gestapo interrogations to understand that her husband had done something dangerous, something that had nearly destroyed their family. Some nights, she looked at him with pride, recognizing the courage it took to strike back against impossible odds. Other nights, Heinrich caught her staring at him with something closer to fear, as if she was seeing a stranger who had been hiding inside the familiar shell of her husband. They didn't discuss it directly, because speaking the truth aloud would be too dangerous, but the silence itself became its own form of communication. Anna stopped asking questions about his day, stopped inquiring about difficult customers or supply problems. She understood that there were parts of Heinrich's life now that she couldn't know, secrets that protected her through ignorance. The intimacy they had built over 30 years of marriage had been fractured by necessity, replaced by a careful performance of normalcy that fooled their neighbors but not themselves. The winter of 1943 into 1944 was brutal for Berlin, and not just because of the cold. Allied bombing raids intensified, turning nights into exercises in terror as sirens wailed and explosions shook the city's foundations. Heinrich found himself welcoming the bombs in a way that felt almost insane, because their chaos provided cover for his own internal devastation. When everyone was afraid, his specific fear became less noticeable. When everyone was traumatized, his trauma blended into the collective suffering. He would stand in bomb shelters surrounded by neighbors and strangers, listening to the thunder of explosives overhead, and think about the SS officers who had consumed his contaminated meat. Some of them were probably dead now, killed by Allied bombs or Soviet bullets on the Eastern Front. Others were still alive, still working in their offices, still managing the logistics of genocide while their bodies carried the permanent damage Heinrich had inflicted. The bombs felt like justice being delivered from above, while his justice had come from within. Two forms of resistance working toward the same goal through entirely different means. By March of 1944, the reality of Germany's eventual defeat was becoming impossible to ignore even for the most dedicated Nazi believers. The Eastern Front was collapsing, Italy had surrendered, and the Allies were clearly preparing for an invasion of France. Heinrich watched these developments with the complicated emotions of someone who desperately wanted his country to lose the war, because losing was the only path to ending the Nazi regime. He thought often about what would happen when the war ended, when Allied forces occupied Berlin and began investigating Nazi crimes. Would anyone ever know what he had done? Would there be records of the Banquet contamination that historians might someday uncover? Or would his act of resistance remain forever hidden, a secret victory that died with him? Part of him wanted recognition, wanted the world to know that not all Germans had been passive collaborators. But a larger part understood that anonymity was safer, that surviving the war meant disappearing into the crowd of ordinary citizens who claimed they had never supported the regime. The surveillance gradually decreased as 1944 progressed, and the SS had larger concerns than monitoring a butcher shop in a city under constant bombardment. Koch never returned, though Heinrich occasionally heard rumors about the Sturmbannführer's activities, tracking resistance cells and deserters. The unofficial understanding remained in place. Heinrich would live quietly, would avoid any further resistance activities, and would be left alone as long as he maintained perfect compliance. It was a bargain that saved his life, but cost him something harder to define. A sense of purpose or agency that had briefly flowered during those November days when he had been more than just a survivor. Heinrich returned to being what he had always been before the Banquet, a skilled craftsman trying to feed his family in impossible circumstances. But something fundamental had changed inside him, a knowledge that he had struck back even if no one would ever know, that he had used his skills to inflict pain on evil men who thought themselves untouchable. That knowledge became his secret fuel, the thing that kept him going through the darkest days of the war's final year. The war ended on May 8, 1945, and Heinrich Wolff survived to see Berlin transformed from the capital of a genocidal empire into a destroyed city occupied by Allied forces. His shop was damaged, but still standing, a minor miracle in a neighborhood where 70% of buildings had been reduced to rubble. The Soviet occupation brought its own terrors and challenges, but also a strange kind of liberation from the specific fear that had defined the previous years. The Gestapo was gone, dissolved along with the entire apparatus of Nazi power. Sturmbannführer Koch's fate remained unknown, lost somewhere in the chaos of Germany's collapse. Heinrich never learned whether the man who had known his secret survived the war or died in its final battles. In some ways, not knowing felt appropriate, a final ambiguity in a story built on secrets and unspoken understandings. Heinrich rebuilt his business slowly over the following years, serving a new clientele in a divided city, carrying his wartime actions as a private weight that grew neither lighter nor heavier with time. Heinrich Wolff died in 1968 at the age of 73, having never spoken publicly about the Banquet contamination. He told Anna the full story only once, in the final weeks of his life, when cancer made secrets feel less important than truth. She listened without interruption, tears streaming down her face. And when he finished, she held his hand and told him she had always known, had always been proud, had always understood that loving him meant accepting the parts of him that had been willing to fight even when fighting seemed impossible. After his death, Anna found a handwritten account of the events hidden in his personal papers, a detailed confession he had written but never shared with anyone. She burned it without reading it completely, understanding that some acts of resistance were meant to remain invisible, that Heinrich's legacy wasn't about recognition, but about the simple fact that he had refused to be complicit when complicity was the easier path. The story existed now only in fragmented memories and rumors, pieces of truth scattered among Berlin's resistance survivors who whispered about the butcher who had poisoned the SS, but whose name most of them never knew. Was what Heinrich did morally justified? That question has no simple answer, and perhaps that's the point. He killed 2 people and permanently injured 15 others through biological sabotage, an act that by any conventional definition constitutes murder and assault. The fact that his victims were SS officers doesn't automatically transform his actions into heroism, because choosing to inflict suffering, even on those who deserve it, changes the person who makes that choice. Heinrich understood this, carried the moral weight of his decision for the rest of his life, never pretended that fighting evil absolved him of responsibility for the methods he chose. But he also lived in circumstances so extreme that conventional morality offered no useful guidance. When the machinery of industrial genocide operates openly around you, when your nephew is murdered for a joke, and your friends disappear into concentration camps, when your daily labor directly supports the comfort of men orchestrating mass murder, what is the morally correct response? Passive resistance, open rebellion that guarantees immediate execution, or the kind of quiet, calculated violence that Heinrich chose? The question I want to leave you with is this: if you had Heinrich's skills, his access, and his knowledge, what would you have done? It's easy to judge historical actors from the safety of distance, to evaluate their choices without facing the impossible pressures they navigated daily. But Heinrich wasn't a soldier or a spy or a trained resistance fighter. He was a butcher, a craftsman with a specific set of skills and a specific kind of access to the enemy. He used what he had to strike back in the only way available to him, accepting risks that could have destroyed everyone he loved. Was his act of resistance meaningful in the context of the Holocaust's industrial scale? Objectively, probably not. 63 sick SS officers didn't slow the machinery of genocide in any measurable way, but resistance isn't always about measurable impact. Sometimes it's about refusing to accept complicity, about maintaining your own humanity by insisting that evil will not operate unchallenged, even if your challenge is small and invisible and ultimately futile in the larger scope of history. This story matters today because it asks uncomfortable questions about collaboration and resistance that remain relevant whenever authoritarian power operates openly. We like to believe we would be heroes in Heinrich's situation, that we would risk everything to fight injustice. But most people in Nazi Germany weren't heroes. They were ordinary individuals who made small compromises that accumulated into complicity, who told themselves that survival required cooperation, who convinced themselves that one person couldn't make a difference anyway. Heinrich was ordinary too, spent years being complicit, and only acted when the moral cost of inaction became unbearable. His story isn't about exceptional courage or moral purity. It's about the moment when an ordinary person decided that doing nothing was no longer acceptable. Even if doing something meant embracing actions he would have considered unthinkable in normal times. That moment of decision, that transformation from passive witness to active resistor, is what makes Heinrich Wolff's story worth remembering even if his name is lost to history.